Hello and welcome back to this damn fully idealistic crusade. In this video I'm going to be talking about the classic pulp hero, the Phantom Detective, and the lovely second and sadly final volume that Sanctum Books was able to put together in their lovely, I think, sort of benchmark for pulp replicas, where they combine two fantastic adventures, so two complete pulp novels plus a wonderful essay about the history of the character, development of the character, and the various influences that led to elements of the character popping up in comics afterwards, because comics drew directly on pulp materials to the point of many historians agreeing that pretty much most of comics lifted so much directly from pulp magazines that they did steal giant chunks wholesale. But also, as discussed here with the Phantom Detective, you have elements that influenced Batman directly, and also had some of the people behind the Phantom Detective stories actually go into comics and work on Batman and brought those elements with them. The key element here, aside from a classical hero with a dual identity and having the public persona sort of be a society type, you have the actual progenitor of the bat signal being used to signal the hero to go and meet downtown in costume, essentially, with the person in higher standing in an official capacity to give them the sort of case they're going to work on. And it was the same person who went and worked on the Batman stories who sort of resurrected the idea and gave us the bat signal we all know on top of the GCPD in Gotham City. But instead of it being the signal with a bat on it here in the Phantom Detective, it's a particular red beacon on top of the newspaper building in downtown, where Richard Curtis Van Loon, alias the Phantom Detective, is called to meet with the head publisher of the Clarion newspaper and then essentially get the information to go off and carry out the investigation of the case. So it's very much exactly where the idea for the bat signal and Batman being called to Gotham City Police headquarters to meet with Commissioner Gordon, it's where it comes from. And of course, Commissioner James Gordon's name actually comes from the Whisperer pulp stories, because the lead character and hero of the Whisperer was James Wildcat Gordon, and that's also seen as a sort of nod to that character. Essentially, there's not many elements in comics that you can't find some sort of pulp connection or element that was lifted from pulp magazines. But here it's an example of somebody coming from the pulp magazines and having to work in comics once the pulps had started to sort of dry up, because comics did kind of take over the readership to a degree, and bringing a lot of those ideas with them and sort of reworking them and bringing them back to life in a way. But the Phantom Detective is, not only one of the most famous pulp characters, but one of the longest running. The Phantom Detective started in 1933, just before Doc Savage started, so it's basically the character that is, I think, technically the second longest running behind the Shoadow, who is the king and originator of the pulp heroes of pulp magazines, and really kickstarted a whole industry of these characters after the initial phenomenal success of the Shoadow magazine. But the Phantom Detective comes in between the Shoadow and Doc Savage in terms of publication history, and lasted basically 20 years, all the way until 1953. Of course, there were a variety of different authors all working under a pseudonym, as most pulp characters were done. The Phantom Detective was published by Thrilling Publications, who was one of the competitors to Street and Smith, who were really the one to match, because they had the Shoadow and Doc Savage, and usually had the strongest readership and sales. But the Phantom Detective is probably the greatest competition outside of the Spider, and definitely was one of the longest running, basically having 20 years of pulp stories. It's also one of the pulp characters that's fallen into the public domain, I think. So that's why you see the Phantom Detective pop up in a lot of different modern publications as one of the pulp characters that pops up that most people might not be aware of today, but it's obviously free to license if he's in the public domain. So that's why you see the Phantom Detective pop up a lot now in modern pulp publications using characters that they are free to use because there's no license to get. But the Phantom Detective is a really fascinating character. There are lots of elements that I think are immediately recognizable. Of course, you have to keep in mind that the Shadow was first. The Shadow was basically first for everything in terms of adventure hero characters. If you think of the joke that South Park made of Simpsons did it first, well, basically for everything in adventure hero storytelling and everything in comics, the Shadow did it first. But the Phantom Detective coming and starting a 20-year run, there are some elements that, link to the Shadow, obviously. But the Phantom Detective, I think, helps to solidify a lot of the ideas that we sort of take for granted in comics. So you have a character with a dual identity. He has had a sort of, I guess could be labeled as sort of an idle, richer person who's had a sort of life as a wastrel in a way, didn't quite know what to do with himself, and he did serve in World War I, which does have elements of some of the character background we eventually get about the Shadow, who of course still remains a mystery in all the best ways. But the Phantom Detective is Richard Curtis Van Loan, who of course comes from money, but sort of stumbles into becoming a crime fighter, and this is where he finds his sort of life's mission, and he then devotes himself to becoming an expert in all areas. So he becomes an expert chemist, he becomes an expert in combat, he trains his body and his mind both, and of course has the financial means to do so, but keeps this a secret and develops the identity of the Phantom Detective to try and instill some fear into the criminal underworld, but also to hide his real identity and make it easier for him to carry out investigations. But he is known to the police and sort of has a rough working relationship with them. Neither side really trusts the other, but they use him when they have no other option. And if any of this sounds familiar, yes, this is very much the Batman playbook, and it's very much recognizable. But it's also the playbook that emerged for a lot of the pulp characters that followed. And because the character lasted for 20 years in terms of the pulp stories, I think a lot of this stuff became ingrained in people's minds. The Phantom Detective also jumped over into other realms, and there were also Phantom Detective comics. So the Phantom Detective was one of the biggest and best known of the pulp characters, and had different iterations as well. But also, the Phantom Detective is an expert and a master of disguise, and this actually goes to a far greater degree than what we see in other characters, even further than what we see in Shadow novels, because the Shadow is also a master of disguise, and Walter Gibson was working with the elements of being a magician, because he himself was a famous magician. But the Phantom Detective has the ability with makeup and also the various things he's taught himself to transform his appearance, and even to the links of being able to essentially disfigure himself and to be able to mimic other people to such a degree that even people who know or are friends of this person won't necessarily know they're dealing with someone imitating that person unless they're, paying 100% close attention, and then they could maybe eventually spot a tell. And this is a really unique element, I think, because it adds a certain extra layer to the characterization. So for me, the Phantom Detective is almost a blending of sorts of the Shadow and Batman and the Whisperer, but also I think there's a great deal of Lon Chaney Sr. in this character. So the whole idea of Lon Chaney Sr. being known as the man of a thousand faces and being able to, play any sort of part with his incredible self-taught knowledge of makeup and being able to physically contort himself for the part. There's a great degree of that in the Phantom Detective, and that, I think, is part of what makes the character feel unique. And also, he always has a calling card that he leaves. He is known as being a great investigator and crusader for justice, but there's also a little bit of, I think, him using the imagery and the idea of criminality to leave his mark in that way. He always has his symbol that he carries. So even if he's not in his traditional costume, which involves him wearing a black domino mask. And doesn't that sound like most every comic character you've ever seen? He has a way to identify himself or to leave his calling card by leaving his mark or his symbol, which is another classic idea of a lot of pulp characters. So I think you'll be able to recognize a good deal of what influenced the Phantom Detective, but a great deal of what the Phantom Detective not only influenced afterwards in other pulp characters and especially in comics, but also helping to solidify the idea of the essentially the superhero vigilante character in American pop culture. It's not often that people are actually going to go and explore the era of pulp magazines and pulp heroes, but if you were ever curious about where all of this stuff comes from, the real explosion of creativity and characters and stories that essentially birthed what we take for granted in comics is all in the pulp magazines. And of the big name pulp characters, the Phantom Detective is one of the giants and is probably only behind the Shadow, Doc Savage, and the Spider in terms of overall longevity and public awareness. But the Phantom Detective is just it's a fascinating character. The stories themselves are fascinating, but of course, because they run over such a long time and have a variety of authors, they will sort of change over the course of time. It's the same thing if you read a lot of the Shoadow novels. Walter Gibson wrote the vast majority of them, but he didn't write all of them, and they did sort of have general tweaks and changes over the longevity of the series due to changing markets and what the publishers were trying to do or insisting on. So I think if you read more stories of pulp characters that lasted a long time, I think you can see varying degrees of this. But here in the Sanctum volume, they were able to do 2 volumes of 2 Phantom Detective stories each in their great style. And this is volume 2 with this incredible cover from the original Pulp magazine cover. And on the back, they of course give you the actual full cover untouched for both novels contained, which is always a great touch of the Sanctum reprints. And then as a great bonus, you get a historical essay about the Phantom Detective and also the people in charge who brought some of the elements of this character into their work on the Batman comics and identifying this containing one of the stories that actually birthed the red light signal that eventually was reworked into the bat signal. But also, this includes a nice bonus of one of the actual comic adventures of the Phantom Detective. So, like all the Sanctum reprints of various classic characters, they always include an extra story or comic or something wherever possible, in addition to always having a fantastic historical essay, which gives you crucial context about the impact of the character and the story, and also specific linkages to elements that will pop up later throughout comics. So here we have the 2 novels plus the essay, and the comic is tucked in at the end. The 2 novels are from 1936 and 1939, and they're by different authors. So I think reading these, while the character remains the same, you can tell that there is a little bit of variance in terms of having different writers, which is, I think, important to note. And it's great that they actually list this because, of course, all the pulp novels were almost always written under a house name, so it's very difficult to know who actually wrote them without the incredible work of pulp historians, of which Will Murray is one of the world's foremost pulp historians, and he contributes another essential essay, which is tucked in between the 2 novels. And I love how Sanctum always did this because it's a nice flow of reading one fantastic pulp adventure, then getting the historical essay with all the great context, then going into a second adventure, and then having a nice little bonus at the end. Of course, Sanctum always reproduces all of the original artwork from the original pulp magazine. All they do is reset the typeface so it's a little easier to read, but everything is perfectly preserved and gives you that wonderful flavor because it is preserved in the original dual column format. And these stories certainly get off to a bang, literally, so there are no punches pulled. And the other fascinating thing about the Phantom Detective is there's a little bit more of getting some of the feeling of a classical detective trying to solve a murder mystery or working in the police as an outside figure. So there are definitely moments where you will get a feeling of a classical pulp adventure character battling crime on his own, like the Shadow, but there are moments that are certainly more like what you would see pop up in Batman. So while the Shadow is primarily the major influence on Batman, I think there are many other influences who don't get mentioned as much. Of course, Zorro and the Phantom, but the Phantom Detective is also one of the major Batman influences, which this volume very much underlines by specifically focusing on the story that introduced the concept that later became the Bat Signal, and also explaining the journey of how this got to the Bat Signal idea we know of. I also love how Sanctum always reproduces the actual artwork exactly how it was, so this very much gives you the exact feeling you would have gotten reading the original pulp novel, and they always do a fantastic job on the reproduction and the setting of the type of the text that they've redone. In the middle, we get Will Murray's fantastic essay, which goes into the development of the character and the publication of the pulp novels, but it also focuses on the editors, in particular Mort Weisinger, who is the person who went over into working on Batman comics and is the person who basically resurrected the Signal idea from the Phantom Detective and basically worked it around a bit, and it became the Bat Signal at Gotham City Police Headquarters to signal Batman to talk things over with Commissioner Gordon. So, you know, this is where the linkage is, and Murray does a fantastic job of explaining how all this stuff came together and giving you that timeline of events. And then we go into the second novel, which is just as two-fisted and intensive as the first, even though it is a different author. Both of these are great novels, and for me, this was a great introduction to reading the adventures of the Phantom Detective, who I had heard referenced before and who I knew about, but I had never actually read one of the pulp novels before, and it becomes very apparent just how influential this character was immediately, and you certainly feel not only touches of the Shadow, but you especially feel Batman elements throughout. So I think the Phantom Detective is definitely one of the super important Batman influences that Batman certainly lifted a lot from, and it just doesn't get talked about very much because unfortunately pulp characters are not as well known today. But if you dig into it, you'll find Batman in particular has elements of a lot of pulp characters. It's not just the Shadow, and there's certainly a big chunk of the Phantom Detective in Batman. And the Phantom Detective, it does not hesitate to use force when it is called for, as the second novel builds to a fantastically action-packed and quite bloody climax after a lot of actually really fascinating back and forth with various gangs and also trying to solve various murders. And then at the end, we get a lovely black and white reproduction of one of the comic adventures of the Phantom Detective. And this also gives you more of the sort of image that's used of the Phantom Detective in terms of the artwork and covers. Of course, he does have his uniform of sorts of the domino mask, usually completed with the sort of top hat and cape, which sort of gives him at times more of like a magician in a mask type look, but he of course frequently is under disguise. But if you were curious, this is the sort of de facto image that we have for the Phantom Detective. Now, unfortunately, Sanctum Books is no longer doing pulp reprints. I think they're pretty much unfortunately done, especially once they lost the various rights to doing the Shadow and Doc Savage reprints. They only did 2 volumes of Phantom Detective reprints, but I think Sanctum is really the sort of benchmark for quality and efforts put into giving you great extras as well in terms of pulp magazine reprints. So I have been trying to complete a Sanctum Books collection, and I've also been trying to pick up the other various volumes they did for different characters outside the Shadow and Doc Savage runs. I would like to get their first volume of Phantom Detective stories, which also has great extras as well. I was just only able to get volume 2 so far, and this is my first experience reading Phantom Detective stories. But thankfully, because I think the character's in the public domain, there are other entities who have been doing reprints, and of these, Adventure House has done, I think, the vast majority, if not almost all, or maybe they have done all of the stories. And so you can actually find those reprints in, sometimes in comic shops or bookstores, but also on the Adventure House website. And I've seen some of those, and they are well done. Some of them are actually full replicas of the entire magazine as well. So there are some great reprints of the vast majority, if not all, of the Phantom Detective stories. And I'll leave a link to Adventure House's website below, which is definitely the premier web store or website for picking up pulps and pulp reprints online. But also you can find some on the used market or on eBay and things. But unfortunately, Sanctum only got to do 2 volumes, and they're the ones who put the wonderful extra efforts into doing nice new typesetting and reproducing all the art and having the lovely historical essays and extras and things. It's a shame they couldn't do more, but at least we do have the lovely Adventure House reprints, and I do plan on checking some of those out because I want to read more Phantom Detective stories. But I just wanted to do a video on the Phantom Detective and this particular volume of stories, which I had a blast reading. I've always meant to read the Phantom Detective. It's just one of the pulp characters I only had a passing knowledge of, but I knew it was one of the big name, long running characters. And certainly when you start digging into the history of pulp characters, that becomes quickly apparent because the character did last in pulp magazine form for 20 years and is, again, pretty much second only to the Shoadow in terms of overall issues and longevity. So it is very much a giant part of the pulp magazine hero era, and of course a great part of what's continued in comics, and with a lot of elements that immediately turned up in comics, and a great deal of what went into the Batman character, especially the whole notion of the bat signal, which can be traced back specifically to a Phantom Detective novel found here in the Sanctum Volume 2 of Phantom Detective stories. So as always, I hope my babblings about classical pulp fiction and pulp heroes and the whole wonderful world of pulp magazines has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I think the Phantom Detective is obviously one of the essential pulp characters. I think these are fantastic stories. They're great fun. I do encourage anyone to check out the Phantom Detective, and especially all Batman fans should read a Phantom Detective story in addition to obviously reading the Shoadow and the Phantom and Zorro and all the other iconic characters who form up Batman's DNA. But of course that goes hand in hand with all comics basically being formed by the pulps in terms of their overall DNA. I also encourage everyone to check out any Sanctum volumes you can find. I think Sanctum very much are the benchmark for pulp reprints in terms of pulp adventure stories, and I just hate that they're no longer really in business and all the volumes are out of print and really drying up on the used market. So it's pretty much just grab whatever you can, and some of these outlier volumes that aren't Doc Savage or the Shoadow can be found still at nice affordable prices, but you do have to just grab them when you can. So as always, please do keep supporting the incredible work of independent publishers and publishers reprinting our popular history, if you will, and also your local independent comic shops and bookstores where hopefully you're able to find some incredible pulp reprints. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.